Okay, get ready because we're diving deep into the life of Jesus today.
Sounds good.
You know, most people think they know the story,
Yay.
but we're going to go way beyond the typical Sunday school version.
Yeah.
We're talking like real historical timelines,
Mhm.
family secrets,
Oh, yeah.
even some alternative takes on his life.
That's right.
Get ready for some serious aha moments.
So many assumptions people make about Jesus's life.
Like what?
Well, like, most people think he was born in the year 1 AD.
Yeah.
But guess what?
Well-
The calendar we use today,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually off by a few years.
Wait, seriously?
It's true.
So when was he actually born?
Scholars now believe Jesus was most likely born
Okay.
sometime between 4 and 7 BC.
Wow.
Yeah, this is because the Bible says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great.
Right.
And from historical records, we know that Herod died in 4 BC.
So that kind of bumps the timeline back a bit.
Exactly.
Okay, so 1 AD is officially debunked.
Out the window.
But what about where he was born? The Bible says Bethlehem. But was that just for the symbolism?
Yeah.
Or was there like a real journey?
Now, that's where things get a little tricky.
Okay.
The Gospel of Luke says the trip to Bethlehem was because of a Roman census.
Uh-huh.
Everyone had to go back to their ancestral homes.
Right.
But here's the thing. Roman censuses didn't actually work like that.
Really?
They were all about where you were living at the time, not your birthplace.
Interesting. So why Bethlehem if the census story doesn't quite add up?
Well, you got to remember those prophecies about the Messiah.
Oh, right, right.
A big one said the Messiah had to be born in the city of David,
Yeah.
which is Bethlehem.
Which is Bethlehem.
So choosing Bethlehem for the story might have been a way to connect Jesus
Okay.
with those ancient predictions.
So it's possible the location was chosen
Yeah,
more for the symbolic meaning
that's right.
than actual geography.
Could be.
Really makes you wonder what other details might have been
Yeah.
influenced by what people already believed
For sure.
about the Messiah.
Definitely something to think about.
And while we're on the topic of details,
Okay.
there's a big chunk of Jesus's life
Mm-hmm.
that the Gospels totally skip over.
Yeah.
It's like his childhood and those teenage years.
It's true. We don't get the story again until he starts his ministry as an adult.
Oh, come on. You're telling me we don't have any stories about teenage Jesus?
Well,
Was he a rebel?
I don't know.
Was he a total goody two-shoes?
Who knows?
Don't you think we'd all love to know?
Yeah, it's a fascinating mystery.
What those lost years were like?
For sure. But the Gospels were really focused on Jesus's divinity
Okay.
and his public ministry.
Right.
The everyday details of his life,
Yeah,
they just weren't considered that important to the writers.
that's fair enough. Still, it's fun to imagine.
I know.
Speaking of family, the Gospels do mention that Jesus had siblings, right?
Yes, that's right.
He wasn't an only child.
Nope. The Bible mentions 4 brothers.
Okay.
James, Joses, Judas, and Simon. And it also says he had at least 2 sisters.
Wow, talk about a big family.
Right.
Did any of them play a role in his life or in his ministry?
Actually, they did.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some of Jesus's brothers,
Yeah.
particularly James, became pretty important figures in the early church.
Interesting.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay, what's that?
Later Christian traditions tend to downplay the idea that Jesus had siblings,
Oh.
possibly to support the idea of Mary remaining a virgin
Oh, wow.
throughout her whole life.
That makes sense. It's amazing how theological ideas can kind of end up shaping
Oh, that's fascinating.
how we understand history.
It really is.
And since we're talking about Mary, let's get to the big question.
Let's do it.
The virgin birth.
Okay.
Is there any historical evidence to back up that claim?
Well, it's interesting because only 2 of the 4 Gospels,
Okay.
Matthew and Luke, actually mention the virgin birth.
Oh, so the other 2 Gospels just skipped over that detail.
Seems that way.
You'd think that'd be a pretty important thing to mention.
Yeah, you would think.
Now, come on.
It's possible they had different sources of information,
Okay.
or maybe they had different theological viewpoints.
Interesting.
Plus, there's a chance that the Hebrew prophecy used to support the virgin birth
Okay.
was mistranslated.
Really?
The word they used often means young woman,
Oh.
not necessarily a virgin.
So the virgin birth might be more of a later interpretation
It's possible.
rather than an actual historical fact.
Yeah, that's a real possibility.
Wow. And you know, when it comes to interpretations,
Mm-hmm.
there are actually more Gospels out there
That's right.
than the ones that ended up in the Bible.
Yeah,
Wait, what? There are more Gospels.
there are.
Fill the tea.
All right, so in 1945,
Okay.
a bunch of texts called the Gnostic Gospels were discovered. They give us totally different perspectives
Okay.
on Jesus' life and what he taught.
Interesting.
Some even hint that he might have had romantic relationships.
Whoa. Okay, now we're getting somewhere.
Right.
Why weren't these Gnostic Gospels included in the Bible?
Mm.
Were they considered too scandalous?
That's possible. But
Yeah.
the thing is, we only have a small fraction
Okay.
of the early Christian writings
Right.
that were circulating back then.
So who knows?
Exactly.
What other stories and perspectives are out there?
That's right. Just waiting to be rediscovered.
That's mind-blowing.
I know, right?
It really makes you realize how much history
Yeah,
we're still piecing together.
for sure.
Okay, so we have these alternative Gospels,
I do.
but let's get back to the ones in the Bible for a minute.
Sounds good.
Who are the other important figures
Okay.
in Jesus' life besides his family?
Well, we can't talk about Jesus without mentioning John the Baptist.
Oh yeah, John the Baptist.
Right.
The voice crying out in the wilderness?
Exactly.
Weren't they related somehow?
They were.
How so?
They were likely cousins,
Okay.
and both of them were preaching
Mhm.
about the coming kingdom of God. They even had similar practices like baptism.
So were they buddies? Or
Mm.
more like rivals?
You know, it's a bit complicated. John baptized Jesus.
Right.
But there were some early Christians who actually saw John
Yeah.
as the more important figure.
So maybe there was some tension
Oh, I'm sure.
between their followers.
It's definitely possible.
And tragically, John's life was cut short,
It was a sad ending.
right? He was executed by Herod Antipas.
That's right.
But why was it just because of his religious teachings?
It was probably a mix of things.
Like what?
Well, John criticized Herod's marriage.
Mhm.
His popularity was growing, and he was
Mm.
making some pretty fiery pronouncements
Oh, really?
about Judgment Day.
So all of that probably led to his downfall.
I would say so.
Wow, that's a harsh reminder of the dangers
It is,
the prophets often faced.
for sure.
Do you think John's death had an impact on Jesus
Hmm.
and his ministry?
It's hard to say for sure,
Yeah.
but it's possible that seeing John executed pushed Jesus to become more politically aware
Right.
and to understand the risks he was facing.
Definitely a turning point
Yeah.
in this story.
exactly.
So let's get to the heart of Jesus' ministry.
Okay.
The miracles.
All right.
Is there any historical evidence to support those stories?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Really?
Whether they're taken literally or
Ah.
seen as metaphors.
Yeah.
The miracle stories played a huge role
Okay.
in establishing Jesus' authority
Right.
and attracting followers.
Okay, but let's be real.
All right.
Turning water into wine,
Yeah,
that's a bit hard to swallow,
I hear ya.
even for someone who's into history and all that,
I understand.
you know?
Well, the Gospels present them as actual events.
Right.
But it's also possible that the stories evolved over time,
Okay.
getting more dramatic with each retelling.
I see.
Kind of like a game of telephone.
I get it. So maybe some details got exaggerated
Maybe.
along the way.
Exactly. But even if you see them as metaphors,
Right.
they still served a purpose.
What's that?
They were a way to communicate deeper truths
Okay.
about Jesus's power and compassion.
That's a good point. It's not just about the literal act itself,
Right.
but what it represents.
Exactly.
And speaking of what things represent,
Yeah,
the role of women in Jesus' ministry seems pretty important.
absolutely. The Gospels suggest that a group of women,
Okay.
including Mary Magdalene,
Uh-huh.
actually provided financial support for Jesus' ministry.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is.
Talk about dedication.
Yeah,
It really shows how much they believed in
Mhm.
Jesus' message.
for sure.
Speaking of Mary Magdalene, let's clear up that whole misconception
Okay.
about her being a prostitute.
All right.
Where did that idea even come from?
It's probably a misinterpretation
Okay.
that came from mixing up several different biblical figures.
Huh.
There's nothing in the Gospels themselves
Really?
to suggest that she was a prostitute.
So is it like a deliberate smear campaign
Maybe.
or just a historical mix-up?
It's hard to say for sure,
Yeah,
but it shows how easily historical narratives can get distorted
for sure.
over time.
So if she wasn't a prostitute,
Mm.
what was her role in Jesus's life?
Well, the Gospels portray her as a close disciple
Oh.
who was there for some of the most important moments,
Like what?
like the crucifixion and the resurrection.
Wow.
Some people even speculate that they might have had a romantic relationship,
Really?
but there's no real evidence to support that.
It's intriguing how much mystery
Yeah,
that surrounds her character.
It definitely leaves room for different interpretations.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
What about the social and political scene?
Right.
During Jesus' ministry, was he like a social revolutionary? Did he challenge the powers that be?
Well, his teachings definitely went against the social norms of his time.
In what way?
He spoke up for the poor.
Cool.
He welcomed those who were considered outcasts. And he preached a message of radical equality.
Those are powerful themes that still resonate with people today.
They do.
But did he actively oppose Roman rule? Was he seen as a political threat?
That's a tough question.
Okay.
He criticized the hypocrisy of the religious leaders and challenged social injustices, but his main focus seemed to be on spiritual transformation, not a political revolution.
So his kingdom wasn't meant to be an earthly one.
Exactly.
But even if his message wasn't directly political, wouldn't his teachings and actions naturally have political consequences?
Absolutely. His message of equality and his criticism of those in power would have challenged the status quo, which could have made him a target for the authorities.
For sure. And there's one event that seems to highlight that potential conflict.
Oh, yeah.
When he cleansed the temple, flipping tables, driving out merchants, that's pretty intense, even for Jesus.
It really is. It's one of the few events that all four Gospels actually agree on.
Really?
And scholars are still debating its meaning.
So what was his motivation?
Right.
Was it just a spontaneous outburst or a calculated act of defiance?
Some people argue it was a deliberate act of protest, meant to spark a rebellion, or maybe even provoke his own arrest and death.
Whoa, so it's possible he was intentionally choosing a path of confrontation.
It's definitely a possibility.
Wow.
But we also have to remember that the Gospels themselves offer different interpretations of this event.
Oh, okay.
Some focus on his anger at the corruption he saw, while others see it as a prophetic act against those who are abusing their power.
Right.
It's a complex event that can be understood in many ways.
It's amazing how such a dramatic scene can lead to so many different interpretations.
It really speaks to the complexity of Jesus's character and the ambiguity surrounding his motives.
All right, so we've talked about the social and political implications of Jesus's ministry, but ultimately his story leads to his trial and crucifixion. What do we really know about those final days?
Well, the details of his arrest and trial are a bit murky, with each gospel giving a slightly different version of events.
So what are the facts that we can be sure about?
We know for certain that he was arrested and brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor.
And what were the charges against him?
Sedition was likely the main charge. The Romans saw him as a potential threat to their authority.
But wasn't his movement primarily a religious one?
Yes, but remember the context. Any challenge to Roman rule, even if it was framed in religious terms, could be seen as a threat.
And what about the trial itself? Was it a fair process?
The Gospels portray the Jewish authorities as playing a key role in condemning him. But there are historical questions.
About what?
About whether the trial was actually legal and fair.
So it's possible the Gospels might be giving us a biased view.
It's possible, the trial.
It's important to keep in mind the context in which these texts were written.
Okay, so regardless of the specifics of the trial, we know that Jesus was ultimately crucified.
That's right.
Was that a common punishment in Roman times?
It was.
Really?
Crucifixion was a brutal and humiliating way to execute people.
Wow.
And it was usually reserved for the worst offenders. Especially those seen as enemies of the state.
So his execution by crucifixion confirms that the Romans considered him a political threat.
It's a grim reminder of how power worked back then.
Wow.
And the brutal realities of Roman rule.
It's a stark contrast to the message of love and forgiveness that Jesus preached.
It is.
Okay, so we've reached the climax of the story. Jesus' death on the cross.
It's a powerful image. But for Christians, of course, the story doesn't end there.
That's right. The resurrection is at the very heart of Christian belief.
But is there any historical evidence to support the claim that Jesus rose from the dead?
The primary evidence comes from the Gospels themselves, which describe the empty tomb and appearances of Jesus to his disciples after a death.
But could there be other explanations for the empty tomb?
Sure.
Like maybe the body was stolen?
Possibly. It's possible. Those are possibilities that scholars have explored.
Right.
It's also worth noting that it was common Jewish practice to move a body to a permanent burial place after a temporary burial.
So the empty tomb might not be the definitive proof.
That's right.
Of a resurrection that some people believe it to be.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about the appearances of Jesus after his death? Do those accounts hold up under scrutiny?
Well, the Gospels present them as real events.
Okay.
But skeptics argue that they could be interpreted as visions or hallucinations brought on by the grief and trauma of his death.
So the resurrection ultimately comes down to a matter of faith.
For many, yes.
Yeah?
It's a belief that goes beyond historical proof.
Okay, so we've covered a lot.
We have.
From Jesus' birth to his death.
Yeah.
And the claims of his resurrection.
Big topics.
But what about the aftermath? How did his movement evolve after he was gone?
Well, the belief in his resurrection transformed his followers' despair into hope. And that led to the formation of the Christian movement.
So you could say the resurrection was the spark
that
ignited the spread of Christianity.
In many ways, yes.
Wow.
It transformed Jesus from a crucified prophet into a divine savior.
Yeah.
And that inspired his followers to share his message far and wide.
It's amazing how a single event can have such a profound impact
It is.
on the course of history.
Absolutely. And it's also worth considering
Okay, what's that?
that the disciples might have intentionally promoted the idea of Jesus' divinity to legitimize his teachings and ensure that the movement would survive.
So it's possible that the theological interpretations of Jesus' life evolved over time.
That's possible.
Shaped by the needs of the growing Christian community.
Exactly. It's a reminder that history is always being written and rewritten, influenced by various factors and perspectives.
That's a fascinating insight.
Yeah.
So we've explored the historical Jesus, sifting through facts and interpretation.
That's quite a puzzle.
But what about the Jesus of faith?
Yeah.
The figure who continues to inspire millions around the world.
That's where things get even more complex and nuanced.
Oh, how so?
The Jesus of faith goes beyond historical debates and speaks to individual beliefs and spiritual experiences.
So we've learned a lot about the man.
Yeah.
But the mystery of his divinity remains.
Precisely, and that's part of what makes his story so enduringly fascinating.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to take a quick pause. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the life of Jesus.
All right.
And explore how his movement became a global phenomenon.
Looking forward to it. Before we paused, we were talking about the impact of Jesus' resurrection on the birth of Christianity.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing how a movement that started with the execution of a seemingly ordinary Jewish preacher.
I know, it's wild.
Could become one of the most influential religions in the world.
For sure.
You know, it makes you wonder, wasn't the idea of a God dying and coming back to life like a pretty common theme?
It was.
In ancient mythology.
You're hitting on a key point. The concept of God's dying and being reborn was definitely around in many different cultures.
So what set Christianity apart from those other belief systems?
Right.
What made it so unique and appealing that it took off the way it did?
Well, there are a few things that contributed to Christianity's spread.
Okay.
First off, the message of Jesus' resurrection offered this radical sense of hope. It wasn't just about a better life after death, but about transforming the world we live in right now.
Okay.
A coming kingdom of peace and justice.
So it gave people a powerful vision for a better future.
Absolutely.
Both for themselves and for society as a whole.
Exactly. And this message really resonated with people who were living under oppression, facing poverty, and dealing with social injustice.
Right.
Christianity offered them a sense of belonging and purpose, promising that even the most marginalized people would be accepted and valued.
In the eyes of God.
Precisely.
That's a powerful message for sure.
Yeah.
But I've also heard that Christianity's structure and organization helped it spread. Is that true?
You're right about that. The early church, led by people like Peter and Paul, developed a strong organizational structure.
In what way?
They established leadership roles, ritual, and a system of beliefs that provided a sense of unity and continuity.
So it wasn't just a bunch of individuals with a shared belief.
Right.
There was a real sense of community.
Yes.
And shared goals.
Exactly. They created a framework for spreading the message, building churches, and translating texts. This allowed Christianity to take root in different communities across the Roman Empire.
That makes sense. It's fascinating how these organizational aspects played a role in the success of the movement.
It's true.
But didn't the Roman Empire persecute Christians?
They did.
In the early days?
In those early centuries,
yeah.
Christianity was seen as a threat to Roman authority.
In what way?
Christians refused to worship the Roman emperor as a god.
Right.
And that was considered a form of treason.
So their belief in one god clashed with the whole Roman pantheon.
You got it. They were even accused of atheism.
Wow.
Because they didn't believe in the traditional Roman gods.
So this led to periods of intense persecution.
It did.
With Christians facing imprisonment, torture, even death.
That's right.
So how did they survive all of that?
Well, despite the persecution, Christianity just kept spreading.
Wow.
A big reason for this was its message of hope.
Okay.
And the strong bonds within its communities.
Yeah.
The faith resonated with people from all walks of life.
Okay.
Including some within the Roman elite.
So it wasn't just a religion for the poor and marginalized?
No, it crossed social boundaries.
Huh?
And by the 4th century, Christianity had become so widespread that Emperor Constantine officially recognized it.
Right.
This paved the way for it to eventually become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire.
Talk about a dramatic turnaround.
Right.
From a persecuted group to the official religion of the empire.
It's a powerful example of how ideas can spread.
Yeah.
And how resilient people can be when they believe in something.
Okay, so we've traced Christianity's path.
We have.
From its humble beginnings to its rise to power.
Such a fascinating story.
Well, let's take a step back and think about the legacy of Jesus himself. How did he impact the course of history?
You know, his impact is huge. Christianity, inspired by his life and teachings, has profoundly shaped Western civilization.
In what way?
Influencing everything from art and music to literature, philosophy, law, and even social structures.
It's hard to imagine Western culture without the influence of Christianity.
I agree.
His teachings on love, compassion, forgiveness, and justice,
they
still resonate with people.
They do.
From all sorts of backgrounds, even those who don't identify as Christian.
Absolutely. It speaks to universal human values and aspirations.
So we've talked about the historical context, the development of his movement, and his lasting legacy.
Big stuff.
But after centuries of study and debate, can we really ever know the real Jesus?
That's the big question, isn't it?
I guess so.
The historical Jesus will always be seen through layers of interpretation, theological doctrines, and cultural biases.
So we're always looking at him through a particular lens?
Precisely. Remember, the Gospels were written decades after Jesus lived. Based on oral traditions and the theological agendas of the writers.
So it's a mix of memory, belief, and interpretation.
Exactly. And over the centuries, those interpretations have been shaped by countless theologians, artists, and thinkers, each adding their own layer to the portrait of Jesus.
It's like a giant tapestry.
That's a great way to put it.
Woven with threads of history, faith, and imagination.
For sure.
So if there's no definitive answer to who the real Jesus was, what's the point of all this exploration?
The search itself is valuable. Wrestling with these questions, grappling with the complexities of his life and teachings, that's what keeps his story alive and relevant.
So it's not about reaching a fixed conclusion, but about engaging in an ongoing dialogue.
That's right.
With his legacy. That makes sense. And isn't that what faith is all about? A continuous process of seeking, questioning, and reinterpreting.
Absolutely.
I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking.
It has been.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious about your personal take on Jesus.
Okay.
Do you see him as a divine figure, a social revolutionary, a wise teacher? What stands out to you?
That's a tough one. I think he embodies aspects of all of those. But for me, what really shines through is his radical empathy. His ability to connect with people on a deep human level. To see their suffering and to offer compassion and hope.
That's a beautiful way to describe it.
Thank you.
His ability to connect with the human heart regardless of someone's social standing or religious beliefs.
Exactly. And that's a message that's as relevant today as it ever was. Reminding us of the power of love and compassion in a world that's often driven by division and conflict.
So well said. And on that note, it's time for us to surface
Okay.
from this deep dive. But before we go,
Yeah.
I have a few final thoughts to share.
Okay.
About how you can continue your own exploration of Jesus' life and legacy.
I'm ready.
So welcome back to our deep dive into the life of Jesus. You know, it's been quite a journey.
It really has.
We've looked at the historical context, the evolution of his movement,
right,
and the impact his message has had across centuries.
But absolutely.
But like with any good deep dive, we've probably ended up with more questions than easy answers.
That's the beauty of it. The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to explore and understand.
So true. And it brings us back to the question we started with.
Okay.
Who was the real Jesus?
Right.
Was he the divine figure so many believe in?
Yeah.
Or was he a revolutionary human whose message was later embellished?
It's a question that has fascinated and challenged people for centuries.
What insights can we draw from our deep dive to help us grapple with this?
Well, I think it's clear that Jesus was a complex and multifaceted figure.
Okay.
He doesn't fit neatly into any one category. You know, he was a product of his time and place, deeply rooted in Jewish tradition.
Right.
But he was also a radical visionary who challenged the social norms and religious conventions of his day.
So he was both a traditionalist?
Yeah, kind of a walking contradiction.
And a revolutionary? That's fascinating.
Exactly. And that tension is part of what makes him so compelling.
Yeah, I could see that.
He embraced the spiritual heritage of his ancestors while also forging a new path, one that emphasized love, compassion, and a radical vision of equality.
Those are themes that have resonated with people throughout history.
They really have.
And across cultures.
It's amazing.
But how much of his message is rooted in his original teachings?
Right.
And how much has been shaped by later interpretations?
That's a key question to consider. We have to remember that everything we know about Jesus comes to us through layers of interpretation.
Okay.
The Gospels were written decades after his death, shaped by the theological perspectives of the writers and the needs of those early Christian communities.
So we're seeing him through multiple lenses.
We are.
And those lenses have shifted and evolved throughout history.
They have. Each generation has reinterpreted Jesus in light of their own cultural context and spiritual yearning.
So it's not just about uncovering the historical Jesus, but about understanding how his message has been received and transformed.
Exactly, and that leads us to the most crucial question of all.
Okay, what's that?
What does Jesus mean to you? How does his story resonate with your own life and your own beliefs?
That's a powerful question, one that each of us needs to wrestle with on our own terms.
Absolutely. There's no single right or wrong answer.
Right.
It's all about personal reflection and spiritual exploration.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. We've debunked some myths.
We have.
Uncovered some surprising facts.
For sure.
And encountered some enduring mysteries.
It wouldn't be a deep dive without some mystery.
Right.
I hope this journey has inspired you to continue your own exploration of the life and legacy of Jesus.
Even after centuries of study and debate, his story continues to raise questions.
It does.
Challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely.
And inspire us to dig deeper into the mysteries of faith history and what it means to be human.
Beautifully said.
So what will your next deep dive be?